In the shadows of medieval Europe, long before the rise of the Knights Templar, there lingered whispers of a bloodline said to carry both divine right and dangerous secrets, a dynasty of long-haired kings, their very appearance striking terror and reverence into their people. Men who ruled with an aura of mystery, yet whose origins are shrouded in legend. They were the Merovingians, the forgotten rulers of the early Frankish kingdom. Some say they were chosen by God. Others whisper of something stranger, that their bloodline was not entirely human. Close your eyes and imagine Europe in the 5th century. The mighty Roman Empire, the empire that once stretched from the sands of Africa to the fog-draped shores of Britain, was collapsing. Its armies fractured, its emperors little more than pawns of intrigue. Across the continent, tribes once considered barbarians moved through the ruins of Rome's roads and aqueducts, carving out their own kingdoms from the wreckage. It was an age of uncertainty, an age where faith and violence walked hand in hand. And out of this twilight world emerged a dynasty that, for nearly 3 centuries, would rule with both terror and fascination. A dynasty that would later be called the Merovingians. But who were these strange kings? Why have their names faded into obscurity, when their legacy is said to carry secrets powerful enough to shake the foundations of Christianity itself? To answer that, we must step back into the mist of the Dark Ages, when kings were half warrior, half mystic, and their blood was believed to be touched by the divine. The Merovingians ruled the Franks, a people who lived in the region we now call France and parts of Western Germany. The Franks were fierce, pragmatic, and restless, a patchwork of tribes united by shared language and tradition, yet divided by rival chiefs. In this chaotic world, strength was everything. A leader who could command loyalty in battle could carve his name into history. The Merovingians did exactly that. Their line is said to have begun with a semi-mythical figure named Merovech, from whom the dynasty took its name. We will explore his strange and legendary origins in the next chapter. But for now, what matters is that his descendants established themselves as kings unlike any other in Europe. They were called the Reges Criniti, the long-haired kings. This detail may sound trivial, almost poetic, but to the Merovingians it was a matter of life and death. Their long hair was not merely fashion. It was sacred. It was said to be the visible sign of their divine right to rule. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him of his power, to humiliate him, to reduce him from monarch to ordinary man. For their subjects, those flowing locks symbolized a connection between the earthly and the divine, a reminder that their kings were not just chosen by God, but somehow closer to him. This was a world where symbols mattered, in a time when most people could not read or write. Kingship was not proven by parchment, but by presence, by ritual, by appearance, by aura. And the Merovingians mastered this aura. The most famous of their line was Clovis I, who came to power in the late 5th century. A man of cunning and ferocity, Clovis united the Frankish tribes under his rule and began to carve out what would become the foundations of modern France. He was a warrior king known for his ruthlessness in battle, yet he also understood something deeper, that power in Europe was no longer just about the sword. It was about the cross. Clovis married Clotilde, a Burgundian princess who was a devout Christian. At the time, the Franks still followed their old pagan gods, spirits of the forest, the rivers, the sky. But Christianity was spreading fast, carried by monks and bishops who promised salvation not just for the soul but for the kingdom. Clotilde urged Clovis to convert, but he resisted until a crucial battle changed everything. According to legend, Clovis, facing defeat against a rival tribe, prayed to the Christian God for victory. He promised that if he triumphed, he would be baptized Victory was his, and Clovis kept his word. In 496, he was baptized in Reims by Saint Remigius in a ceremony that echoed through history. With him, 3,000 of his warriors accepted the faith, plunging into the baptismal waters and rising as Christians. This moment marked a turning point, not just for the Franks, but for all of Europe. Clovis's conversion cemented an alliance between the Frankish crown and the Roman Catholic Church. The Franks became defenders of the faith, wielding the sword of war in the service of the cross. But as with all alliances, this one carried both blessing and curse, for while the Church gave legitimacy to Clovis and his heirs, it also planted the seeds of conflict. The Merovingians were never simple vassals of Rome. They had their own mystique, their own aura of sacredness, which sometimes clashed with the authority of bishops and popes. The rule of the Merovingians was not just about battles and baptisms. It was about legend. They were seen as rulers with supernatural gifts. It was said they could heal with their touch, that they could command loyalty not just through fear, but through a charisma that seemed otherworldly. Their courts were places of ritual where kings presided with hair flowing down their shoulders, embodying a power both physical and mystical, but power breeds enemies. And slowly, over generations, the Merovingians began to lose the strength that had made them rulers of Europe. The dynasty grew vast, divided among heirs, weakened by the endless feuds of brothers and cousins. Their sacred aura could not hide the fact that real power was slipping from their hands. Behind the throne, a new class of officials, known as the mayors of the palace, rose to prominence. They were supposed to be servants of the kings, administrators of their lands. But as the Merovingians grew weaker, these mayors grew stronger, pulling the strings of government, while the kings became figureheads. By the 8th century, the once mighty Merovingians were derided as the Roi Fainéants, the do-nothing kings, and yet whispers persisted. Whispers that though their crowns had been stolen, their bloodline carried a deeper secret, that their power did not end with their earthly thrones, but continued in hidden ways, woven into the mysteries of Europe's future. So who were the Merovingians? Truly warriors who rose in the ruins of Rome, semi-divine kings whose hair carried sacred power, heirs to an ancient and dangerous secret. History tells us they were all of these things, but history also tells us only part of the story, because the true enigma of the Merovingians is not just how they lived or how they ruled, but what they represented. For in their time, kingship was not merely political, it was spiritual. To rule was to embody a code, a connection between heaven and earth, and the Merovingians embodied it more fully than perhaps any dynasty before or since. Their reign set the stage for centuries of myth, conspiracy and speculation, for though their dynasty eventually fell, their legacy endured in whispered legends of sacred blood, in the guarded secrets of medieval orders, and in the fertile imagination of all who sought hidden truths. But this was only the beginning. The true mystery lies not in their power as kings, but in their origins so strange, so otherworldly, that even their own people whispered about it in hushed voices. For the founder of their dynasty, Merovec, was said to have been born not from a man, but from a creature of the sea. And it is to this mystery that we now turn. If every dynasty begins with a story, then the Merovingians begin with one of the strangest legends of all. It is a tale whispered by medieval chroniclers, retold in monasteries, and later cloaked in the veils of conspiracy. It speaks of a king, a queen, and a child born not entirely of this world. A child who would give his name to the dynasty that followed the line of Merovec. But to understand the mystery, we must first travel to the windswept shores of northern Gaul, sometime in the middle of the 5th century. The Roman Empire was a crumbling shell, but its echo still haunted the land. The Franks, fierce and ambitious, lived along the Rhine, always pressing further into the decaying heart of Gaul. Their chieftain was a man named Clodio. His wife was young, noble, and, if the legend is true, destined to bear a child unlike any other. According to the story, Queen Basina, Clodio's wife, was bathing in the sea when something extraordinary occurred. From the depths of the water emerged a creature, part man, part beast. Medieval writers called it the Quinator, a monstrous being, described as having the body of a bull, the strength of a sea god, and the mystery of the unknown. What exactly was this creature? Was it an invention of pagan folklore, or the echo of something far older? Some suggest it was a distorted memory of Neptune, the Roman god of the seas. Others claim it was a symbolic tale, a myth spun to explain the extraordinary charisma of the Merovingian line. But still others, more daring, whisper that the story may conceal a truth, that the dynasty's origins were not entirely human. The tale continues. Basina was overcome by this being, and from their union a child was conceived. That child was Merovac, a boy born of both man and monster, both earthly and something else. It was Merovac who gave his name to the dynasty, the Merovingians. In later centuries, his descendants would proudly call themselves his heirs, never denying the strange legend, but instead embracing the aura it gave them. To their subjects, this was not shameful. It was a mark of destiny. If Merovac was born of the sea, then he was touched by powers beyond mortal men. His bloodline was different. His bloodline was sacred. Legends of semi-divine rulers were not new. In fact, almost every great civilization crafted stories of kings and heroes born from gods. The Greeks had Heracles, son of Zeus. The Sumerians told of Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine. Even Rome claimed descent from Aeneas, the Trojan prince who was the son of a goddess. These myths were more than stories. They were codes of legitimacy, ways of saying, our rulers are not like other men. And so it was with the Merovingians. By tracing their origin to the Quinator, they were setting themselves apart from ordinary chieftains. They were not just warriors seizing power by force. They were chosen, touched, destined. Yet there is something strange about the Merovingian myth. Unlike the polished legends of Greece or Rome, their story feels raw, unsettling, almost monstrous. The Quinator is not a shining god of Olympus, but a strange, shadowy being, half hidden beneath the waves. It is primal, untamed, otherworldly. Why would a dynasty embrace such a tale? Perhaps the answer lies in what the story truly meant. The sea has always symbolized mystery, the unknown, the unconscious, the realm beyond human understanding. To say the Merovingians were born of the sea was to say they came from that mysterious realm, carrying with them knowledge and power ordinary mortals could not comprehend. But as Christianity spread, this story took on a darker edge. To the church, the idea of kings born from sea monsters carried uncomfortable associations. Was the Quinator a pagan god, a demon, or something even worse? The church preferred kings whose legitimacy came from baptism and anointment. A dynasty claiming descent from strange creatures of the deep was suspicious, if not outright heretical. And yet the legend persisted. Chroniclers did not erase it. They repeated it. Perhaps they could not resist the allure of the strange. Perhaps the Merovingians themselves ensured the tale endured, knowing that it gave them a mystique no priest could grant. What if the myth was not meant to be taken literally? Some scholars suggest it was a metaphor, perhaps for a political alliance, a marriage between rival peoples, or the merging of pagan and Christian traditions. The Quinator might not have been a monster at all, but a coded way of speaking about something dangerous, something best disguised in the cloak of myth. And yet, what if there was more? Modern conspiracy theories have taken the legend far beyond the medieval imagination. Some writers suggest that the Quinator was not a beast, but a symbol of something extraterrestrial, that the Merovingians were a bloodline seeded not by gods or monsters, but by visitors from the stars. Others claim that the story conceals the truth of an even greater secret, that the Merovingians were descendants not of a sea creature, but of a holy union, perhaps the bloodline of Christ himself disguised in pagan symbolism to escape persecution. Whatever the truth, the legend gave the Merovingians an aura of sacred otherness. Their long hair, their supposed healing powers, their strange charisma, all of it fed into the idea that they were touched by forces beyond the ordinary. For their followers, this was not superstition. It was a reason to believe. And belief in the Dark Ages was everything. Think of it. A people emerging from the ruins of Rome, looking for stability, for a leader, for a sign that their future was secure. What better reassurance than a king whose bloodline was said to be born of the deep mysteries of the world? A king whose very existence proved he was chosen, marked by destiny different from all who came before. Merovec's descendants would rule for generations. Some would be strong, others weak, but all would be seen through the lens of that founding legend, that they carried within them the blood of the sea, the spark of the unknown, and while their crowns would one day fall, the story of their origins never vanished. Instead, it lingered, echoing across the centuries, inspiring myths of sacred kingship, fueling whispers of hidden bloodlines, and feeding the insatiable human hunger for mystery. So when we speak of the Merovingians, we are not just speaking of kings. We are speaking of a code, a story, a lineage wrapped in the waves of legend, a bloodline said to carry both human and something more. But here lies the question, was this legend a clever invention, a way for ambitious rulers to cloak themselves in divine mystique? Or was it a truth too strange, too dangerous to ever be admitted openly? For the Merovingians themselves, it did not matter. The myth was the power, the myth was the crown, and whether born of sea gods, monsters, or something far stranger, their bloodline was set apart. Yet their true rise to greatness would not come from myth alone. It would come from conquest, from faith, and from a single decision that would forever bind their dynasty to the fate of Europe. For when Clovis, descendant of Merovec, bent his knee in baptism, he did more than accept the Christian God. He bound the mysterious bloodline of the Merovingians to the destiny of Christendom itself. And that, as we shall see, was a union both powerful and perilous. When we last left the Merovingians, their dynasty was shrouded in mystery, born of Merovec, the child of legend, touched by the sea, and the strange creature known as the Quinator, their bloodline, was already set apart. But myth alone could not build an empire, to enrule, to carve their name into the memory of Europe. They needed more. They needed a king strong enough to unify their restless tribes, bold enough to seize opportunity from the ruins of Rome, and shrewd enough to forge alliances that would outlast his own lifetime. That king was Clovis. Clovis was born around the year 466 into a fractured world. The Roman Empire in the west was only a ghost of its former self. By 476, the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. The roads, once patrolled by Roman legions, now lay in the hands of local warlords. It was a time when kingdoms rose and fell within a single generation, and survival belonged not to the lawful, but to the cunning. Clovis inherited the leadership of the Salian Franks, one of the many Frankish tribes. He was still a young man, barely 15, when he took the throne after the death of his father, Childeric I. For most, such youth would be a weakness. For Clovis, it was the spark of something unstoppable. From the very beginning, he was a man of ambition. His first moves were not cautious consolidations of power, but bold strokes. He began expanding, pushing the Franks southward into Gaul, the land once ruled by Rome. Here he clashed with rivals Visigoths, Alemanni, and Burgundians, each vying for a piece of the empire's corpse. Clovis was ruthless. Chronicles describe him as fierce in battle, unflinching in cruelty when it served his purpose. He killed rivals, sometimes even family, to secure his throne. Yet behind this savagery was a cold intelligence. He understood that brute force could win battles, but only alliances and symbols could win a kingdom. One such alliance was with Clotilde, a princess of Burgundy. She was beautiful, devout, and above all, Christian. Their marriage would prove fateful. At this time, most of the Frankish people still followed their old gods, Wotan, Dona, the spirits of forests and rivers. Rome had fallen, but Christianity was spreading, carried by missionaries, bishops, and queens like Clotilde, who saw in conversion both salvation and politics. Clotilde urged Clovis to abandon the old gods and embrace the Christian faith. He resisted, like many warriors. He trusted in his sword and in the gods who had carried his ancestors to victory. Baptism seemed like weakness, a surrender to a foreign faith, but destiny had other plans. In the year 496, Clovis fought the Alemanni at the Battle of Tolbiac. The Franks were struggling on the brink of defeat. As legend tells it, Clovis raised his eyes to the heavens, not to Wotan or Dona, but to the god of Clotilde. "If you grant me victory," he prayed, "I will believe in you and be baptized in your name." Moments later, fortune turned. The Alemanni king fell in battle, and his people surrendered. The Franks triumphed. True to his vow, Clovis kept his word. That Christmas, in the city of Reims, he was baptized by Saint Remigius. The ceremony was grand, drenched in symbolism. 3,000 of his warriors followed him into the baptismal waters. An entire people shifted that day, not only in faith, but in destiny. Why was this so important? Because Clovis did not convert to just any Christianity. Many Germanic tribes of the time had already embraced the faith, but not the version recognized by Rome. They followed Arianism, a doctrine declared heretical by the Catholic Church. The Visigoths were Arians. The Ostrogoths were Arians. To the Catholic bishops of Gaul, these Arian rulers were dangerous competitors. Clovis, however, chose Catholicism, the faith of Rome itself. In doing so, he gained a powerful ally, the Church. To the bishops, Clovis was a gift from heaven, a warrior king who could defend Catholic lands against both pagans and heretics. To Clovis, the Church was more than faith, it was legitimacy. It was the seal of authority that turned a tribal chieftain into a king by divine right. From this moment, the destiny of the Merovingian dynasty was bound to the destiny of the Catholic Church. And yet this alliance was never simple. For though Clovis accepted baptism, he never abandoned the ruthless pragmatism that had defined his rise. After his conversion, he continued to eliminate rivals with cold efficiency. He lured enemy leaders to feasts, only to have them slain. He turned the sword of faith into a weapon of politics, using his new alliance with Rome to expand his power across Gaul. In time, Clovis conquered much of modern France and beyond. By the time of his death in 511, he had united the Frankish tribes and laid the foundations for what would become the Kingdom of France. He established Paris as his capital, and though centuries of struggle lay ahead, his reign marked the true beginning of Frankish dominance in Europe. But even as he built his empire, shadows gathered. For the Merovingians, baptism was not the end of their mystique. Some say it was the beginning of a deeper contradiction. On one hand, they were Christian kings, defenders of Catholic orthodoxy. On the other, their bloodline carried whispers of pagan magic, of sea monsters of otherworldly origins. The church needed their swords, but perhaps feared their secrets. What did the bishops think of the Quinator legend? What did Saint Remigius think when he baptized Clovis, knowing that the dynasty he blessed was said to be born of something outside the order of creation? These questions were left unspoken. The Church chose not to confront them, at least not openly, but beneath the alliance between crown and altar, tension simmered. For how could the guardians of Christ fully trust a dynasty whose very origin seemed to mock the natural order? Clovis died in 511, leaving his kingdom divided among his sons, as was Frankish custom. His heirs inherited not only his lands, but his dual legacy, the mantle of Christian kingship and the aura of a bloodline marked by myth. Some would expand the kingdom, others would squander it. But the dynasty endured. For nearly 3 centuries after Clovis, the Merovingians ruled. They were kings who touched the sick and were said to heal them. Kings who cut their hair only in ritual, for their long locks symbolized sacred power. Kings who presided over courts that blended Roman law with Frankish tradition, Christianity with echoes of pagan ritual, and yet, as their line continued, so too did the whispers that beneath the baptismal robes and Christian crowns, the Merovingians guarded something more, a secret, a code, a bloodline that carried with it knowledge too dangerous to reveal. Clovis had bound his dynasty to Rome, but he had also bound them to suspicion. The Church could never fully escape the sense that these kings, born of sea and legend, were not entirely its own, and perhaps the Merovingians themselves never wished to be, for they were more than kings. They were the keepers of something older, something deeper, a legacy that would outlive thrones and crowns. But history is never kind to those who hold too tightly to power, and as the Merovingians' heirs inherited the crown, they also inherited enemies. The Church that had once blessed them began to look elsewhere for protectors. New families rose, new powers emerged, and slowly the dynasty that claimed descent from monsters and kings began to fade. Yet even in their decline, their legend grew. For if they lost the crown of France, they would gain something more enduring, a place in the myths and mysteries of Europe itself. But that is a tale for later. For now, we leave Clovis standing in the baptismal waters of Reims, his long hair gleaming, his dynasty reborn in the name of Christ, yet carrying with it the mark of the sea, the secret of a strange bloodline. The rise of Clovis was the rise of the Merovingians, but as history would show, every rise carries within it the seed of a fall. And for the Merovingians, the true trials were only beginning. Clovis had united the Franks, baptized his people, and bound his dynasty to the Church. But the Merovingians were never ordinary rulers, and their kingship was never a simple matter of politics. To understand the true power of their dynasty, we must step beyond battles and treaties, beyond crowns and swords, and into a realm where kingship was not only a function of rule, but a sacred ritual. For the Merovingians were not merely kings. They were living symbols. Their very bodies, their very presence, were believed to radiate divine power. To follow a Merovingian king was not only to obey a ruler, it was to stand in the presence of something holy. The long-haired kings. The Merovingians were known as the Reges Creniti, the long-haired kings. At first, this might seem like a small detail, a curious fashion statement in the chaos of the Dark Ages. But in the worldview of the time, hair was far more than decoration. To the Franks, long hair was a sign of sacred authority. It marked the king as chosen, untouchable, set apart from the rest of his people, just as Samson in the Old Testament drew his strength from his uncut hair, so too did the Merovingians seem to draw power from their flowing locks. To cut a Merovingian's hair was not simply to humiliate him, it was to destroy his kingship itself. Chronicles describe dethroned Merovingians being forcibly shorn, their sacred hair stripped away, reducing them from kings to mere monks or prisoners. To the people, such an act was more than political, it was spiritual death. Their hair, then, was their crown, organic, untouchable, alive, and as long as it flowed, so too did the aura of their rule. The healing kings, But the sacredness of the Merovingians went beyond their hair. They were believed to carry mystical gifts, the most famous of which was the power to heal by touch. This belief, later associated with medieval monarchs like the Capetians and the Stuarts, was already present in Merovingian times. People whispered that a king could lay his hands upon the sick, the wounded, even those suffering from scrofula or other afflictions, and bring relief. Whether miracle or myth, this power strengthened the bond between king and subject, for in an age of plague, war, and famine, to have a ruler who could heal was not merely political, it was divine reassurance. The king's touch became a kind of sacrament, a sign that God's favour rested upon him and his bloodline. The church, of course, claimed that healing belonged to saints and priests. And yet the Merovingians seemed to blur this line. They were kings, but they moved in a liminal space, half monarch, half holy figure, kings as priests. In the early medieval world, kingship was never fully separate from priesthood. To be king was to preside over rituals, sacrifices, and sacred festivals. Even after the rise of Christianity, echoes of these ancient roles remained. The Merovingians embodied this tension. They were Christian kings, baptized and blessed by bishops, yet they retained the aura of pagan priest kings. They were mediators between heaven and earth, guardians of a sacred bond that was older than Rome, older even than the church. Their courts reflected this. Councils and gatherings were not only political assemblies, but ritual spaces where oaths were sworn, relics displayed, and symbols invoked. The king's throne was not just a seat of power, but a kind of altar. And when the king died, his burial was not a mere interment, but a sacred drama. Archaeologists have uncovered Merovingian tombs filled with treasures, swords, jewelry, vessels, charms. The kings were buried as if they were crossing into another world, their power continuing beyond death. See, the aura of the bloodline, what truly set the Merovingians apart, was not simply the rituals they performed, but the belief that their blood itself was different. Their origin story, the union of a queen and the sea creature known as the Quinator, fed into this belief. See, it implied that the Merovingians carried within them something otherworldly. To their followers, this made them more than men. To their enemies, it made them dangerous. This aura of sacred bloodline gave rise to stories that persisted for centuries. Whispers that the Merovingians were not just rulers, but guardians of hidden knowledge. Whispers that they carried secrets too great to be entrusted to ordinary men. Some said they were linked to the ancient Druids, inheritors of a priestly wisdom suppressed by Rome. Others claimed they held relics, holy objects of unimaginable power. Still others would later connect them to the most controversial claim of all, that their bloodline was tied to Christ himself. The tension with the church, here lies the paradox of the Merovingians. On the one hand, they were the church's allies. Clovis's baptism had made the Franks defenders of Catholic orthodoxy against pagan and Arian foes. The bishops of Gaul supported them, blessed them, and called upon their armies. On the other hand, the Merovingian semi-divine aura, their mystical powers, and their strange origin story made them deeply unsettling to the very church that crowned them. The church wanted kings who were servants of God. But the Merovingians often seemed like rivals to God, figures who carried their own sacred authority, independent of bishops and popes. This tension would grow over the centuries. The Merovingians, with their flowing hair and sacred presence, stood as living reminders of an older, stranger world, a world where kings were not merely political rulers, but walking mysteries. The decline of the sacred kings, yet as powerful as the aura was, it could not protect them forever. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the Merovingians were weakening. Internal rivalries divided the dynasty. Successive kings grew less commanding, less able to dominate their ambitious nobles. The sacred aura of their bloodline remained, but the practical power of governance slipped away. Into this vacuum stepped the mayors of the palace, administrators who at first served the kings but eventually became the true rulers. The kings themselves, their hair still long, their rituals still intact, became little more than figureheads. They were called the Roy-Fainéants, the do-nothing kings, and yet even as their political power faded, their legend only grew. Perhaps because when kings lose their armies and crowns, all that remains is their myth. And the Merovingians' myth was stronger than any sword. The mystery deepens. Why did the Merovingians inspire such awe? Why did their subjects cling to the belief that their bloodline was sacred, even as their earthly rule crumbled? Perhaps it is because people hunger not only for power, but for meaning. In the chaos of the Dark Ages, a king who could heal, who carried divine aura, who was said to descend from something beyond human. Such a king offered more than order. He offered mystery, and mystery endures. Though the Merovingians would eventually lose their crowns, whispers of their sacred kingship did not die. Instead, they flowed into legends of the Grail, into secret histories of hidden bloodlines, into the imagination of poets, heretics, and centuries later, conspiracy theorists, for the Merovingians were not merely rulers of the past. They became symbols of an eternal question. What if true power is not in crowns or thrones, but in the blood itself? The age of the sacred kings would not last forever. The dynasty that began in myth and reigned in mystery would eventually be dethroned. But as we shall see, their fall was not an ending. It was the beginning of an even greater enigma. For though the Merovingians lost their thrones, many believe their bloodline never died. And if that is true, then the secret of the sacred kingship lives on, hidden in shadows, waiting for the day when it might rise again. The Merovingians had risen in mystery, ruled in majesty, and cloaked themselves in the aura of sacred kingship. For nearly 3 centuries, they stood as the guardians of a dynasty unlike any other, half warriors, half mystics, heirs to a bloodline that legends claimed was not entirely human. But history is unforgiving. For every dynasty that rises in glory, there comes a moment when the tide turns, when enemies gather, allies betray, and sacred symbols lose their power. For the Merovingians, that moment came not in a single battle or sudden collapse, but in a slow, lingering decline, a decline filled with whispers, shadows, and betrayal from within. The long fall, by the 7th century, the Merovingian dynasty was faltering. Their kings still wore their hair long, still healed by touch, still carried the aura of sacred blood. But aura alone could not govern a kingdom. The Frankish realm had grown vast, stretching across Gaul into Germany and toward the Low Countries. To rule such a sprawling land required more than mystique. It required administration, diplomacy, and control. The Merovingian kings, divided by inheritance customs and weakened by rivalries, struggled to hold their realm together. Into this vacuum stepped a new power, the mayors of the palace. Originally, these men were stewards, administrators, meant to manage the royal household and oversee the kingdom in the king's name. But over time, their influence grew. While the sacred kings sat on their thrones as symbols, the mayors wielded the real power, commanding armies, collecting taxes, and forging alliances. By the late 7th century, the Merovingian kings were derided as Roy-Fainéants, the do-nothing kings. The last of the sacred kings, one of the most striking examples of this decline, was King Dagobert I, who reigned in the early 7th century. Dagobert was powerful, ambitious, and one of the last Merovingians to command real authority. He built alliances, expanded his influence, and left behind the golden tomb of Saint Denis, the resting place of future French kings. But after Dagobert, the dynasty weakened further. His heirs quarrelled, and the kingdom splintered. By the time of Dagobert's descendants, The Merovingian throne was more ceremonial than sovereign. Kings were paraded with their long hair, seated on throne thrones, and displayed to their subjects. Yet behind them, the mayors of the palace pulled the strings. One chronicler remarked that the kings were like shadows, appearing at festivals and rituals, but never deciding the fate of their own people. The rise of the Carolingians among the mayors of the palace. One family in particular rose to prominence, the Carolingians. The most famous of them was Charles Martel, known as the Hammer. It was he who, in 732, defeated the Muslim armies at the Battle of Tours, halting their advance into Western Europe. To the church, Charles was a saviour. To the people, he was the true protector of Christendom. But Charles Martel was not king. He ruled in the king's name, while the Merovingian monarch, little more than a figurehead, sat in ceremonial splendour. Charles's descendants, however, would not be content with power behind the throne. They wanted the crown itself, and so began the final betrayal. The deposition of Childeric Ythuri. The last Merovingian king was Childeric Ythuri, a man whose reign was little more than a formality. His hair still flowed, marking him as sacred, but his authority was gone. By 751, Pippin the Short, Charles Martel's son, was the mayor of the palace. Pippin had all the power, but he lacked legitimacy. He was not of the sacred bloodline. To seize the crown, he needed the church's blessing. And so he turned to Pope Zachary. Pippin sent envoys to Rome with a simple but devastating question: who should be king? The one who carries the title, or the one who holds the power? The Pope's answer sealed the Merovingians' fate. He declared that it was better for the one who held real power to be king. With this decision, centuries of sacred kingship were undone by a single stroke of papal logic. In 751, Childeric Ythuri was deposed. His long hair, symbol of the dynasty's sacred right to rule, was cut. Stripped of his divine crown, he was sent to a monastery where he would live out his days in obscurity. The Merovingian dynasty was finished. The Carolingians, beginning with Pepin the Short, and later his son Charlemagne, would now rule the Franks. Betrayed by the church, the deposition of Childeric Ythuri was more than a political shift. It was a betrayal. For centuries, the Merovingians had defended Catholic orthodoxy. Clovis's baptism had bound their dynasty to the church. They had fought against pagans, against Arians, against the enemies of Rome. And yet, in the end, it was the church that sanctioned their downfall. Why? Perhaps because the church had grown uneasy with their mystique. Perhaps because a dynasty born of sea monsters and cloaked in whispers of strange bloodlines was too dangerous, too uncontrollable. Or perhaps simply because the Carolingians offered something the church valued: more raw power, military might, and unshakable loyalty. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. The long-haired kings, once sacred mediators between heaven and earth, were reduced to forgotten monks. Their line, at least publicly, was extinguished. But was it truly the end? And yet, here is where the story turns from history into mystery. For even as the Merovingians vanished from the throne, whispers remained that their bloodline had not died. Some claimed that branches of the family survived, hidden in monasteries, cloaked in secrecy, waiting for their chance to return. Centuries later, in places like Rennes-le-Chateau, strange discoveries would spark new theories that the Merovingians were not only heirs to Clovis, but heirs to something far greater. See, that their bloodline carried the ultimate secret of Christendom, the blood of Christ himself. The church may have cut their hair. The Carolingians may have stolen their crown. But the mystery of the Merovingians, what they knew, what they carried in their blood, could not be erased. Legacy of the betrayed, and so the Merovingians became something greater than kings. They became legend. Their story passed into whispers of secret societies. The priory of Sion, the Knights Templar, their name resurfaced in esoteric texts, in Grail legends, in modern conspiracy theories. From Holy Blood, Holy Grail to the Da Vinci Code, their shadow lingers. What is it about this forgotten dynasty that fascinates us still? Perhaps it is the strangeness of their origin. Perhaps it is the drama of their fall. Or perhaps it is because they embody something deeper, the eternal tension between sacred mystery and earthly power. The Merovingians remind us that kingship is more than politics. It is myth, ritual and belief, and myths, unlike dynasties, do not die. Closing reflection, the story of the Merovingians is one of rise and fall, of sacred kingship and betrayal, of legends that refuse to fade. They began in mystery with a queen and a creature of the sea. They rose in power under Clovis, binding their dynasty to the fate of Europe. They ruled as sacred kings, their hair flowing, their touch healing, and they fell in betrayal, their crowns stolen by men once sworn to serve them. Yet even in their defeat, they endured not as kings, but as symbols of a secret too great to vanish, a code too powerful to be forgotten. For in the end, the Merovingians may have lost their throne, but they gained something far more enduring, a place in the eternal mystery of history. And perhaps, just perhaps, their bloodline flows still, hidden in shadows, waiting for the day when it will rise once again.